On Zionist Literature. Book by Ghassan Kanafani. Translated by Mahmoud Najib. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Ghassan Kanafani, 1936 to 1972. Introduction to the English translation. Preface to the first edition, 1967. Preface to the current edition, 2022. Introduction. 1. Zionism fights on the linguistic front. 2. The birth of Zionist literature. 3. Race and religion in Zionist literature beget political Zionism. 4. The birth and development of the character of the wandering Jew. Ghassan Kanafani is regarded as one of the most well-known Arab writers and journalists of the past century. His literary writings, in novels and short stories, are deeply rooted in Arab and Palestinian culture, and have inspired generations during his lifetime and after his martyrdom, both in word and deed. He was born in Acre in northern Palestine on April 9, 1936, and lived in Jaffa until May 1948, when the war that established Israel compelled him to flee his homeland with his family to Lebanon and then Syria, after which he lived and worked in Damascus, Kuwait and finally, from 1960, Beirut. Kanafani was martyred on July 8, 1972, in Beirut along with his niece Lamise in a car bomb planted by Israeli agents. Kanafani published 18 books until his untimely death, along with hundreds of articles on culture, politics, and the struggle of the Palestinian people. All of his works have been republished in numerous editions in Arabic after his assassination. His novels, short stories, plays and articles have been collected and published, the literary works of which have been translated into 20 languages. Some of Ghassan's work has been incorporated into school and university curricula. Some of his plays have been made into theatrical productions and radio programs in Arabic and other languages, and 2 of his novels have been adapted into cinematic features. His work, written during the period between 1956 to 1972, continues to enjoy increasing levels of interest to this day. Introduction to the English translation. Ghassan Kanafani doesn't lend himself to easy categorization. He is well known to Palestinians, and to those interested in Palestine, but not as a singular figure. He was a Marxist revolutionary, a party spokesperson, a novelist, a political theorist, a schoolteacher, an artist, a newspaper editor, and a committed internationalist. These disparities of perception befit Kanafani's heterogeneous life, and he was accomplished in each of these roles. Kanafani is less known for another vocation at which he also excelled, literary criticism. Throughout his short life, Kanafani reviewed and analyzed creative writing in multiple genres, having been a student of literature at the University of Damascus where he met his mentor George Habash, founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, a Marxist-Leninist organization that was of significant size and influence in the 1960s and 1970s. In addition to On Zionist Literature, Kanafani authored 2 books critiquing Palestinian literature. Unlike his novels and short stories, these works have not been translated into English. As On Zionist Literature illustrates, Kanafani was a searing and incisive critic, at once generous in his understanding of emotion and form and unsparing in his assessment of politics and myth. We cannot adequately comprehend his literary criticism without also delving into the political sensibility he brought to the enterprise. It helps, as well, to examine the strictures of the enterprise itself. Literary criticism is not supposed to be apolitical. This may sound absurd on its face, the sort of thing no serious reader of literature has ever considered possible, but the stricture isn't an axiom so much as a kind of ideological coding. In particular, it functions to reinforce intellectual and economic orthodoxy. By consigning political criticism to a lesser category of cultural labor, standard-bearers of academe and the arts inhibit revolutionary thought within institutional settings. Anything that threatens centers of power earns the label of apolitical, perforce a negative evaluation, and the disrepute that comes along with it. Power therefore comes to embody the apolitical. This sort of environment is unwelcoming of critics such as Kanafani. Running afoul of bourgeois customs was no issue to Kanafani, however, who wanted his critical approach to inform Palestine's struggle for national liberation. His approach is less an arbitrary choice than a result of his thesis that Zionist literature is itself deeply political, in the crude sense of the term. Kanafani identifies a colossal scheme among Zionist leaders to conscript a wide range of artistic work into service of their colonial project. He marshals a long list of examples to make his case: Yael Dayan's Envy the Frightened, Ahad Haam's essays on Zionism and Judaism, Leon Uris's Exodus, and a variety of other creative and historical material. Nor is his critique limited to the texts themselves. Kanafani examines the publishing industry and associated cultural institutions as sites of imperial politics. The Nobel Prize Committee comes in for an especially harsh evaluation. Why did the Nobel Prize Committee reward a reactionary and chauvinistic author, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, in 1966, whose writings lack all of the requisite literary standards for such an award? For Kanafani, the Western literary scene is not an open forum based on meritocracy, but a tightly controlled marketplace meant to satisfy the predilections of a voracious ruling class. Many would-be authors with revolutionary devotions have tried to navigate the industry and reached a similar conclusion. Kanafani makes it clear that Zionism isn't coterminous with either Judaism or Jewish people. He identifies ruptures in the movement's self-definition and its popular definition owing to its provenance in Western imperialism. He unambiguously implicates Jews in Palestinian suffering and considers it an abrogation of intellectual honesty to exculpate Jews qua Jews of Palestinian dispossession, but shows that mainstream notions of Jewish peoplehood are refracted through systematic normalization of Zionism, which brands itself as a natural occurrence. While Zionism does not in fact emerge from scriptural tradition or cultural practice, it insists on its own supremacy as the primary model and final arbiter of Jewish peoplehood. This effort was not the sole domain of Jewish people. The imperial powers and philosemitic luminaries played an important role. Kanafani does not treat Zionism as a natural response to European antisemitism, instead exploring intracommunal dynamics around class and religious devotion. His summary of Jewish integration into modern Europe is perhaps the most controvertible part of the book, but his key point warrants serious consideration as it inverts the common narrative of Zionism as an existential necessity. For Kanafani, Zionism was ultimately a choice born of internalized racism and a supremacist inclination to seek power in the service of imperial domination and accumulation at the expense of rank-and-file Jews. He argues, while opportunities for social integration and assimilation were increasing, we can nevertheless note a rising chauvinistic current among socio-economically privileged Jewish circles. The constant stream of Zionist literature that began to appear by the middle of the century finally broke into the mainstream by the century's end, leading up to the consolidation of political Zionism at the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. Well read in Jewish literature beyond what he conceptualizes as the Zionist variety, a category that in any case includes Christian authors. Kanafani evinces an impressive understanding of liturgical traditions, secular narratives, and linguistic developments. Scholars of Judaism will no doubt find great provocation in Kanafani's sweeping historical summaries, but his sharp acumen, from the perspective of the colonized party, is the book's most compelling quality. We would do well to focus on his argument that Zionism is neither a cultural inclination or a political necessity. It is a material phenomenon rooted in chauvinistic ideas of culture and politics that tried to squash revolutionary and communist Jewish politics in Europe. Kanafani's historical overview illustrates the movement's deep-seated contradictions. To understand Zionist literature, then, the critic must analyze the painstaking and often contradictory process of forging a notion of singular nationhood from disparate, and in some cases ill-fitting, communities. This is so because Zionism's crude political goals could not achieve dominion of the Western imagination without the dexterity of literature and other creative media. Rewriting and revision were crucial features of the strategy for the Zionist imperialist domination of Palestine. Movement leaders mined the past in order to create a viable pretext for settling the Levant. By and large, they turned to the Bible for source material, a practice that has inspired a large body of scholarship, but Kanafani shows that much of the decisive labor of invention occurred through cultural artifacts. Those artifacts, creative writing, primarily, either directly informed the Zionist project or were conscripted into the service of Zionism by ideologues and various bourgeois tastemakers. Authors mobilized for the cause included well-known Victorian figures such as Benjamin Disraeli and George Eliot. One of many astounding extracts that Kanafani highlights as he analyses the early development of Zionist tropes is the moment a character in Eliot's novel Daniel Deronda calls explicitly for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine more than 70 years before such a thing became a reality. The world will gain as Israel gains. For there will be a community in the van of the East which carries the culture and the sympathies of every great nation in its bosom. There will be a land set for a halting place of enmities, a neutral ground for the East as Belgium is for the West. In some ways, Kanafani's approach prefigures the emergence of cultural studies in the following decade, particularly its British variant. Influenced by Marxist scholars such as Stuart Hall and Raymond Williams, critics felt less constrained by pretensions of objectivity and began exploring literature as an ideological commodity, particularly in terms of its uses in propaganda campaigns against communism. Anyone who believes in a neutral cultural marketplace will likely find trouble with Zionist literature, which treats that kind of attitude as silly and unserious. The cultural marketplace is a site of accumulation like any other capitalist industry. Only its products enter the economy in states of abstraction. That marketplace is the aesthetic foundation of hegemony, the raw material of political common sense. On this basis, Kanafani suggests that adherence to Zionism precludes apprehension of Zionist literature. Indeed, to even recognize the category is a sort of intellectual reconditioning. The great irony of Zionist literature is that it becomes legible only through rejection of Zionism. Otherwise, that literature presents as a natural occurrence in the modern world. Zionist literature has to appear purposeless in order to accomplish its purpose. Such is the ideological coding Kanafani spends so much time uncovering. The literature is both precursor and postscript to the colonial project. The two phenomena are mutually constitutive. You have to understand both in order to understand either. Where might this approach lead us in terms of intellectual and political labor? This question will probably remain in the reader's mind throughout the book. Kanafani leaves us no choice but to contemplate questions of liberation. The urgency and occasional hyperbole of his tone don't allow for apathy or disinterest. And his methodology isn't conducive to any kind of detachment, an attitude Kanafani would have found alien considering the revolutionary mood among Palestinians and Arabs more generally in the recent aftermath of the 1967 war. Palestinians were sorting the pain of defeat into new and more urgent forms of resistance. The PFLP was only months away from its formal establishment, and, aged only 31, Kanafani was filled with a vigor that practically jumps off the page. His is an analysis of political material, but also a material analysis of politics. On Zionist literature resonates with the contemporary reader, within and beyond Palestine, but it's also a document of its time, intent on subverting the popular mythology of a plucky, besieged Israel surrounded by aggressive Arab hordes. Yet because many of the conditions Kanafani addressed continue to exist, and in many cases have gotten worse, it does no good to view this book as a mere artifact. While it is of its time, specific to the political and economic circumstances of Kanafani's era, it speaks to ongoing forms of colonial violence and dispossession central to the Palestinian experience in the present moment. Then as now, that experience has a universal dimension. Kanafani's fierce counterpoint to Zionist literature aims to show that Palestinian revolutionary sentiment and national liberation are indispensable to the creation of a better world. He pursues this aim in a moment of Zionist triumphalism, when even the left in the global north had largely swallowed Israel's self-victimizing narrative. Kanafani and the Palestinian cause were not without allies in the global south, however, on the contrary. In the same year that On Zionist Literature was written and released, Beirut, the city where Kanafani had lived since 1960, hosted the Third Afro-Asian Writers' Conference. Kanafani almost certainly attended this event, one that upon its conclusion declared a resolution on Palestine that appealed directly to all Afro-Asian and progressive writers around the world to stand in the face of the wide cultural conspiracy launched by the Zionist movement. A separate resolution that stressed the need to counter imperialist and neo-colonialist infiltration in the cultural field more broadly listed the Zionist movement, an imperialist tool used to serve the imperialists' aggressive interests, as a prominent example of this trend. Point 2. Therefore, it's crucial to figure out how to make sense of Kanafani in English, and in the Western milieu summoned by this translation. One of the challenges of consuming translated material is constant awareness that the text was composed in a different language, and then trying to imagine its particular resonance in the original. Even the most faithful translation will have difficulty conveying the precise context of certain words and phrases. This issue is doubly complicated in the case of Palestinian writing in Arabic, which rendered into English enters a linguistic and geopolitical framework constitutionally hostile to Palestine. This isn't to say that On Zionist literature should not have been translated. To the contrary, translation is a tremendous benefit to people unable to read the book in its original language. Broadening Kanafani's audience also broadens access to the sensibilities of Palestine's national struggle, which can get watered down among diasporic communities. Readers, then, should bear in mind that Kanafani spoke a revolutionary language completely legible to Palestinian society, unapologetic in its dignity, assuming a certain level of comprehension and knowledge, and resonant in the indigenous tongue. He wasn't concerned with assuaging liberal sensitivities in the United States, or in Palestine, for that matter. His audience consisted of Palestinians and comrades to the Palestinian cause. This translation allows a new generation to struggle for that cause, as well. This point about Kanafani's audience is not minor. He spends a lot of time on Zionism, but a discerning reader will understand that the book is actually about Palestine and Palestinians. Kanafani knew that it is impossible to write about Israel without also writing about its native population, even when that population goes unmentioned. In such times that the Zionist author does acknowledge the native population, they chose to take a position of almost declaring that the Arabs are a people that do not deserve to live in the first place. In both instances, the Palestinian ends up dehumanized. Before ushering you to the main event, it seems useful to say a few words about the author. Since his murder by Israel in 1972, At age 36, Kanafani has endured as an icon, but in this role his legacy can become rather complicated. Photographs and video clips of Kanafani circulate frequently on social media. Evidently, he is very much alive in Palestine's cultural and political imagination, yet at times Kanafani exists in the abstract, displaced from the material circumstances that defined his work and the revolutionary principles that characterized his ideology. The PFLP, meanwhile, is less prominent than during its heyday of the 1960s and 1970s, but it persists, on the ground and in analysis of Palestine's national question. While plane hijackings and guerrilla warfare are the PFLP's most visible legacy, the group's ideas have also been hugely influential. Many of those ideas are evident in the book that follows, The Imperialist Character of Zionism, The Importance of Narrative in Authorizing State Violence, The Primacy of Class in Both Zionist Colonization and Palestinian Resistance. Kanafani is known differently by Israelis, and, to the degree that they're familiar with him, by Europeans and North Americans. Among the Zionist professional and political classes, he wasn't merely an enemy, but each of the many pejoratives they apply to victims of Zionism: extremist, antisemite, barbarian, terrorist. Although a devoted Marxist, Kanafani was no hero to the Israeli working class, who despised him with equal passion. For his part, Kanafani viewed the Israeli working class as an antagonistic formation given the enormity of the Nakba, and the structural inequality of Israel's legal system. Working class solidarity was viable only in conjunction with decolonization and the end of imperial domination. To this day, Israelis don't really know Kanafani. They know his name. They know his actions. They know his reputation. But they cannot properly comprehend him as an intellectual and activist, and especially not as a human being with the gravitas to inspire his people. Israelis have reduced him to a boogeyman haunting their fantasies of peace. Kanafani knew Israelis extremely well, however. In situations of disparate power, formal knowledge belongs to the oppressor, with its highbrow bureaucrats and bourgeois institutions, but the oppressed possess something more powerful and intuitive, a profound need to free themselves of injustice and subjection. The oppressed, by necessity, have intimate knowledge of the oppressor. This book serves as an excellent example of that maxim. From its inception, the PFLP was devoted to ideas and has a vibrant archive of revolutionary theory, but it also maintains an active military presence among the resistance to this day, very much in the tradition of Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral, three deploying violence not only as a means of territorial and political sovereignty, but as a psychological prelude to liberation. In this way, Kanafani's political and literary work are inseparable. It wouldn't be inaccurate to say that his assessment of Zionist literature is at base an affirmation of Palestine's future. In seeking to understand Kanafani, we do well to abandon discrete ontological and intellectual categories altogether, or at least to think of them as dynamic and interactive. On Zionist literature is political literary criticism, indeed, especially in the sense that it refuses to separate culture from imperialism. Kanafani's political writings, like the broader Palestinian intellectual tradition, are underknown in the Anglophone world despite being so influential in Arabic. The translation of On Zionist literature that follows is an effort to rectify this deficiency. As readers, we can learn a great deal about Zionism and Palestinian resistance from Kanafani's incredible knowledge and experience. We can also follow the book's example and move our comprehension of political material in the Internet age, from the realm of myth into the more satisfying terrain of material politics. Stephen Salaita. Preface to the first edition, 1967. As far as I know, This is the first study by an Arab in Arabic on Zionist literature and its methods and hostile political objectives. The Palestine Research Center of the Palestinian Liberation Organization was motivated to commission Ghassan Kanafani to conduct this study, though the idea was his, in appreciation of this significant dimension of Zionist production, which has been neglected by Arab researchers who have restricted their interests to the politics and practices of Zionism. There is a strong connection between the politics and literature in the Zionist movement, as this book shows. Zionist literature subordinated itself to politics. In this subordination, which takes the ugliest of forms, literature dedicated itself to serving hostile political objectives through the expropriation of land, possessions, rights and freedom of an innocent people through the most grotesque methods including deception, obscurantism and the reversal of the facts. This is how Zionist literature gained its worldwide audience and its widespread acclaim. Indeed, there is hardly a single body of political literature that has enjoyed as much commercial and moral promotion outside of its country of origin. But the reasons for such propaganda and its impact lie beyond the scope of this book, and must be the subject of another study by one of the distinguished researchers at the center who specialize in Zionist media. Of the many angles that the literature in question may be studied, the author of On Zionist Literature chose to trace its history across centuries, prior to the appearance of the contemporary Zionist cause, and to bring its prominent characteristics to light. As such, the author left the literature's secondary characteristics, along with its minor nuances, to be dealt with in another study, which we hope will be completed before long, the comprehension of which will have been facilitated by this first, main and more general study. Anis Sayegh, General Director of the Palestine Research Center. Preface to the current edition, 2022. The first time I met any Palestinian person was during a student conference in Yugoslavia in 1960. I knew nothing then about what had happened to Palestine and the Palestinian people. When the Palestinian representatives told me, I became very angry. Why did I and other Danes not know? I grew up in an intellectual working-class family in Copenhagen, and my father was active in the Danish resistance against the Nazi occupation of Denmark. But even the left-wing press didn't write about what happened when the State of Israel was established in May 1948. And more than 800,000 Palestinians were driven from their homeland by Zionist military forces. It seemed to me that the Zionist influence on European media was almost total. In September 1961, I went on a study trip to Syria and Lebanon to visit some of the students from that conference in Yugoslavia, and to learn more about the destiny of the Palestinian people, the refugees, and their cause. It became a very important chance for me to get to know some of the truth. After 2 weeks in Damascus, I continued my journey to Beirut, and a good friend, Ahmed Khalife, gave me an envelope addressed to his friend, the Palestinian journalist Ghassan Kanafani, then one of the editors of the Arabic weekly Al-Hurriya, Freedom. The paper represented the Progressive Arab Nationalist Movement, ANM, and Ghassan edited its Palestinian affairs. That is how I was introduced to Ghassan Kanafani. He was writing an editorial for the paper and asked me in the meantime to have a look at a book in English about Palestine. After a while we started to talk together about his homeland, Palestine. When I asked him to let me visit some refugee camps, Ghassan fell silent. "Do you think our Palestinian people are animals in a zoo?" he angrily told me after a moment, and then he began to explain, to tell me about his people and his country, how on November 29, 1947, the United Nations, contrary to its own Charter 4, had partitioned Palestine against the will of its Arab population, which then made up 2/3 of the total population and owned more than 90% of the land. How in the final voting only one Asian country, the Philippines, and 2 African countries, Liberia and South Africa, had voted for partition, and of those the former two had been intensively pressured by the United States. Thus the colonialist Zionist state of Israel was forcibly implanted on the threshold of the emerging Third World, without obtaining the voluntary recognition of a single Arab, African, or Asian state, apart from apartheid South Africa. And so Ghassan proceeded to tell me about his beloved Palestine and how he was forced to leave it in 1948 together with his parents, 5 brothers and sisters, and other family members. He was born in Acre on April 9, 1936, at the beginning of the Palestinian Arab Revolt against the Zionist forces and the British Mandatory Authority. During the revolt, the Palestinian Arabs staged a general strike, maybe the longest in history, that lasted half a year. By 1939, when the revolt was put down, 5,032 Arabs had been killed and 14,760 wounded, while 110 were hanged by the British authorities. Ghassan told me about Israeli terrorism, how they forced his people to leave. His hometown, Acre, had been allotted, according to the United Nations partition plan, to the Arabs. But like many other Arab cities and villages, it was conquered by the Zionist forces, and its inhabitants were driven out by physical or psychological force. The Arabs of Palestine were at that time panic-stricken after the massacre of the peaceful and unarmed village, Deir Yassin, on April 9, 1948. In an eyewitness report, the Red Cross representative, Jacques de Reynier, related how 254 women, children and old men were deliberately and cold-bloodedly butchered, and many of their bodies thrown down a well by the Zionist terrorist groups, the Irgun and the Stern Gang. Ghassan's family left Acre shortly before May 15, 1948. By that date, 800,000 Arabs had fled the Zionist terror. And the Arabs continued to flee, the women and children first of all. The men stayed to defend the towns and villages. Soon, Jaffa, Lydda, Haifa, etc., were cleaned of their Arab population. The word is Yigal Allon's, the Palmach commander responsible for these atrocities. When Ghassan's family was expelled from Palestine, they left empty-handed. His father chose to stay in a small Lebanese village, Gaza, near the border. Later on, the whole family moved to a mountain village in Syria. Life there was very hard. Ghassan's father was a lawyer and later had a chance to move to Damascus with the family, and Ghassan and his eldest brother began to work in order to earn a little to support their family of 8 and the 8 other relatives who were living with them. After a while, they both continued their studies at night school, working during the day. At that time, Ghassan was 13 years old. After passing his brevet qualification at 16, Ghassan began to teach at an UNRWA school, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the UN's agency for Palestinian refugees. Before joining the school, Ghassan had been working as an apprentice at a printing press in Damascus, and in 1955 he was asked by the A&M to work partly as an editor for their paper Al-Rai and partly in the printing of it. He became a member of the A&M that same year. The following year he joined his sister Faizeh and brother Ghazi in Kuwait. The 3 of them sent most of their salaries back to the family in Damascus. His father now had a monthly income with which to support the rest of the family. Meanwhile, he obtained permission to practice as an advocate in Damascus, where most of his clients were Palestinians and very poor. During the following 6 years in Kuwait, Ghassan continued his political work. He was teaching art and sport, and in fact those years proved to be a very important part of his life. All his spare time was spent painting, writing and reading, mainly political works, Marx, Engels, Lenin and others. In 1960, Dr. George Habash convinced Ghassan to leave Kuwait for Beirut in order to work on Al-Hurriya. From the first day I met Ghassan, I felt I was confronted with an exceptional human being. Our relationship developed through the Palestinian cause into a personal relationship. In spite of an insecure situation, as a Palestinian, Ghassan had neither passport nor work permit, he had no money. And worst of all, he suffered from an incurable illness, diabetes. We soon realized that only death would be able to separate us. I had graduated as a teacher in early childhood education from the Teacher Training College in Copenhagen in 1956, so I was able to take up a job in an Arabic/English kindergarten in Beirut when I decided to postpone my return to Denmark. 2 months after my arrival in Lebanon, we got married. Neither of us ever regretted it. Like most other Palestinians, we had our difficulties, economically and otherwise. In January 1962, when the political situation was particularly unstable, Ghassan had to remain hidden at home for more than a month because of his lack of official papers. During this period, he wrote the novel Men in the Sun, which later became known throughout the Arab world, and he dedicated it to me. Ghassan translated all his novels and stories for me while writing them, and I became acquainted with his political writing as well. His compulsion to write was unlimited. It was as if he contained a fountainhead of words and ideas from which he wanted to fill page after page about Palestine, his country, and his people. He was always busy, working as if death was just around the corner. Ghassan was a painter and designer as well. One of his paintings from that period depicts man crucified in time. I was greatly influenced by Ghassan's ideas, but he never tried to impose them on me. The same went for our foreign friends, among them several journalists who visited us at home and discovered the Palestinian cause through him. Many of them later took up the problem in their own countries. My relationship with Ghassan's family became very close. From the beginning they welcomed me with all their hospitality and warmth, and I came to love them dearly. Our married life was based on trust, respect, and love, and so it was always significant, beautiful, and strong. Our first child, a boy, was born August 24, 1962. Fayez, it means victor, was named after his grandfather. Ghassan was now busier than ever and completely involved in his work. He was by this time established as a writer and journalist, and in 1963 he was offered the post of editor-in-chief of a new daily, Al-Muharrir, which represented the Nasserite and progressive forces. The paper soon became the second daily in Lebanon and was also widely distributed to other Arab countries. He worked for 5 years with Al-Muharrir, at the same time publishing the weekly supplement Falastin, which represented the Palestinian branch of the ANM and dealt with Palestinian affairs specifically. During 1963 to 1964, the ANM was on the way to scientific socialism, and in 1964 it decided to prepare for armed struggle in Palestine. In 1965, Ghassan was officially invited to China and India, where he met the Chinese Foreign Minister, Cheng Li, the Indian Prime Minister, Shastri, and other political leaders in those two countries. He discussed the Palestinian problem with them and was no doubt greatly influenced by this trip. After his second trip to China, where he participated in the Afro-Asian Writers' Conference, 4-year-old Fayez gained a beautiful baby sister. We called her Layla, after the heroine in one of the most famous stories of Arab folklore. Layla is also a Scandinavian name, common among the Sami people who live on the lands north of the Arctic Circle. Ghassan adored his children and often wrote about them. Even though his time with us was limited, he used to play with them frequently and would teach them many things. Fayez and Layla loved to work with him in our small garden. He seldom lost his temper and never hit them. His enjoyment of their company extended to include their friends. He would often cart them all off to the cinema or join in their games at home. We both enjoyed seeing our family and friends in our home or visiting them in theirs. We would all enjoy nice food, and some of us a good drink, and tell jokes about life and the general situation, even when things were very bad. In general, Arabs love to tell jokes even during very difficult times. Joking and laughing becomes a kind of natural therapy or medicine to keep us going. Ghassan himself had a wonderful sense of humor and sarcasm, which often appeared in his discussions with journalists. Ghassan and I also loved singing and dancing, and sometimes we would go out with a group of good friends for dinner and dance. The summer of 1964 I traveled back to Copenhagen for the first time since I left my family in 1961. Ghassan and Fayez joined me and I introduced them to our family and friends. We spent a wonderful time together. My parents and two brothers even arranged a second wedding party for us and invited our Danish extended family and many friends. It became a very nice evening with speeches, songs, and dances. Ghassan even taught the guests the Palestinian/Lebanese folk dance, the dabkeh, and he gave a very nice speech of thanks to my family. During the following weeks, Ghassan met with politicians, journalists, artists, school teachers, and representatives of labor unions and other persons, mainly from the left-wing parties and those who had been active in the Danish resistance movement struggle against the German occupation of Denmark during the Second World War. He discussed with them the problems of the Palestinian people from the time of the British Mandate in Palestine to the expulsion of the majority of the Palestinians from their homeland by terrorist military forces before and after the Zionist State of Israel was established in Palestine in May 1948. He also discussed with them the role of the Danish media in informing the population of Denmark about the history of Palestine, and the rights of the Palestinian people to return to their homeland, and to combat the almost total domination of the Zionist propaganda on the media. These meetings were very important, and some of the participants later visited Lebanon and Palestine and kept in contact with Ghassan. Ghassan had been collecting books for his study on Zionist literature over the previous year, but it was difficult to access such material in Lebanon as there was a general boycott there, and in other Arab countries on all items related to Israel, including books, newspapers, and magazines. He therefore asked foreign friends to bring such material to him when they visited Lebanon. After our trip to Denmark, he was able to ask some Danish friends to help in providing him with the material he needed for his research. In addition to all his other work and responsibilities as editor-in-chief of Almoharer and Falastin, until late 1967, then with Al-Anwar Daily until 1969 when he established the political weekly Al-Hadaf, Ghassan wrote and published several novels and short story collections and even a detective story. He also wrote and published plays and satirical articles, and he designed several posters and illustrations for Al-Hadaf. Ghassan mostly worked on his literary writing at home after returning from his journalistic work in the evenings or on weekends. He enjoyed creating and to express himself in drawing and paintings and working in clay, which he often did at home when he found the time. Fayez and Layla were willing helpers and happy to watch their father painting and drawing, and they would do their own creative work alongside him. After his assassination on July 8, 1972, a journalist friend wrote in the Daily Star newspaper in Beirut, "Ghassan was the commando who never fired a gun. His weapon was a ballpoint pen and his arena newspaper pages, and he hurt the enemy more than a column of commandos." Ghassan Kanafani. On Zionist Literature. Introduction. The Zionist movement used the weapon of literature in a manner only matched by its use of politics. Zionist literature was a crucial and indivisible part of the movement, which political Zionism employed extensively not only for its propaganda efforts but for its political and military campaigns as well. It would not be an exaggeration to assert that literary Zionism preceded its political counterpart. As soon as the literary movement gave rise to political Zionism, the latter enlisted it to play its designated role in its colossal scheme. And though political Zionism was the product of chauvinism and racism, it was literary Zionism that first exhibited these characteristics. Indeed, This chauvinistic and racist current, along with the politicization of Judaism, were first manifest in literature, as we will see. The increasing racist pressures of the 18th and 19th centuries looked to literary Zionism as the handbook for a chauvinistic Jewish current that was soon to crystallize into a political form. Zionist literature, in this study, refers to all that has been written to serve the movement for the Jewish colonization of Palestine, either directly or otherwise. As such, the term refers to the work of Zionist sympathizers, be they Jewish or non-Jewish. Naturally, this means that Zionist literature, in the sense used here, includes that which was written in non-Hebrew languages by non-Jews, and so includes any text that operated under the banner of political Zionism and served its ends. It also means that we will not commit to the history of Zionism's official establishment at the end of the 19th century, as this study's point of departure, but will instead explore the roots of Zionism in literature by tracing them back to their earliest possible point. This study will therefore regard the establishment of political Zionism as a moment of consolidation in the movement's actual history, which was a product of its early literary precursors. Zionist literature became a critical part of the political movement thereafter as it worked deliberately along its directives and predetermined objectives. We will observe Zionist literature's disciplined march to the rhythm of the political movement as it crescendos from novel to novel, and from story to story, until a clear and uniform position finally renders this literature more of a propagandistic symphony than a creative artistic endeavor. Of course, this study does not claim that it will cover all that could possibly be covered from the many authors, novels and stories that embodied literary Zionism. Such a task would exceed the capacity of a single volume and author. The topic is, in any case, a peculiar one, due to the nature of Jewish history and diaspora. This literature spans an untold number of writings in an uncountable number of languages across long and indeterminate periods of time. To deal with this complexity, this study selected the most prominent works of literary Zionism, or what may be regarded as emblematic of its essence. It also attempted to cover the geographical areas that are most pertinent to the Zionist cause, as well as those of the Arabs, while its timeframe extends to the periods that most influenced these issues. The main purpose of this inquiry is to shed new light on an essential but yet to be recognized aspect of the infernal machinations of the Zionist movement. The experience of Zionist literature may be historically unprecedented in its instrumentalization of art in all its forms, through which it carried out an extensive process of disinformation which eventually produced exceedingly dangerous results, chief among which is the wholesale indoctrination of humanity through what are ostensibly tools of enlightenment and truth. Israel's media campaign is therefore not a mere passing raid. This is conquest upon well-trodden terrain, striking deep into the consciousness of an audience that has long been deceived. To comprehend this process, we must acknowledge the role that Zionist literature has surreptitiously played to serve political Zionism's illegitimate ambitions. Many questions come to mind, and answering them remains a pressing need. What did a book like Daniel Deronda accomplish to prompt Israel to name one of Tel Aviv's most important roads, after its author within days of establishing the state in 1948? What did the wondrous tale of Elroy accomplish to later become Nazism's covert mentor? How, why, and when did the tale of the wandering Jew change from a symbol of persecution to that of racial supremacy? What was the function of Shakespeare's Shylock in the history of literary Zionism? What was the basis upon which a novel like Exodus became nearly the singular source for all kinds of Western readers to understand the events of the Middle East? How did post-1948 Zionist novels falsify history, erase the facts and steer their Western audience to support an unjust cause? Why did the Nobel Prize Committee award a reactionary and chauvinistic author in 1966, whose writings lack all of the requisite literary standards? Is it a coincidence that the phrases employed in Western political commentary resemble, almost verbatim, those of Zionist novels? Was the Western press's reaction to the Israeli aggression of 1967 a merely superficial phenomenon? Or was it a logical outcome of a long-standing exercise in cultural disinformation via the Zionist literary and artistic apparatus, which laid the groundwork for such coverage? Why does the Western reader accept the same racist and fascist positions in Zionist novels that are deemed to be contemptible when taken by non-Jews? Such questions can only be answered by tracing the development of literary Zionism of past and present across various locales. This is an attempt to expose a most grotesque and wide-ranging process of cultural disinformation, which serves illegitimate political and military ends, and has largely succeeded in justifying those ends to large numbers of people, having encompassed them under a virtually impenetrable shield. This study does its utmost to avoid two pitfalls, which are necessarily present under the current conditions. 1. Avoid drawing a broad conclusion from a single source, regarding a partial position as evidence of an existing phenomenon, or to make much of what is cursory. The study therefore tries to find the common thread that runs across the largest possible number of available sources. 2. Avoid letting its involvement in the struggle cause it to neglect the requisite level of objectivity. Naturally, being mindful of such pitfalls does not prove having avoided them altogether. This is only to indicate that such caution has accompanied the study's conduct. Another point must be made. This study has cited many examples of Zionist literature's positions on a variety of topics of historical, political, and ethical significance. These positions were not met with detailed refutations because their errors are regarded to be self-evident. This can be noted in how a given Zionist novel would claim that Israelis have treated the Arabs with unparalleled grace, that Arabs are a primitive, barbarous, and immoral people, that the Crusades were directed against Jews, not Arabs, that Arabs possessed nothing in Palestine for at least 5 centuries, that the Israeli soldier is the most moral and militarily capable fighter in the entire world, that ordinary Arab citizens regard Jews to be a source of salvation, that, had it not been for their feudalist masters, the Arabs would have cooperated with the Zionists. When the study references such texts, it does not concern itself with discussing or responding to such claims, per se. That task is left to be settled in scores of historical and political volumes, in addition to one's lived experience and the events on the ground. Indeed, such references do not appear here to be debated but to serve the exigencies of the research. All that this study hopes to achieve is to shed new light on that exacting principle: know your enemy. Chapter 1. Zionism fights on the linguistic front. The role of the Hebrew language suddenly grew in importance during the period that preceded and followed the birth of political Zionism at the end of the 19th century. Hebrew broke out of its centuries-long condition of being a traditional language of religion and was compelled, through various means, to become a national language. Within just a half a century or so, Hebrew was subjected to extraordinary pressures in order to elevate its status from a language of religious affairs to one that prompted an internationally respected institution, such as the one that oversees the Nobel Prize, to award its 1966 prize in literature to an Israeli author who wrote in beautiful Hebrew. The vehemence that political Zionism had displayed on this front can only be matched by its complementary struggle against social integration. As the movement struggled to transform Judaism into a national bond, it was necessary for it to appeal to Hebrew because it represented the only possibility through which such a bond may be forged. Judaism had ceased to be a national bond for nearly 2,000 years, and had since lacked all the requisites of national cohesion. Indeed, there had not been a common sense of geography, civilization, economy, culture, or politics among the world's Jews, And there certainly was not an ethnic kinship either. Semitism itself was a negative identity, in that it was defined from without. Put differently, it was not the Jews who self-identified as Semites but rather how, especially European, anti-Semites defined Jews. Thus, language became of utmost importance. Hebrew was subordinated to the movement's political ends and was made, through incremental and constant direction, into a justification for the movement's existence because it represented the tenuous link that connects the world's Jews. Because Hebrew actually reflected a religious bond and not a national one, Zionism regarded the task of changing that to be among its foremost priorities. The initiative here belongs to Ahad Ha'am, a pioneer of Zionism whose articles undermined the remnants of the movement for social integration among the Jews of Eastern Europe. He heavily employed the phrase, "the last Jew and the first Hebrew," which later became a Zionist slogan in the cultural field especially. The movement also waged a relentless campaign against Jews who remained attached to other languages, including Yiddish, which is spoken among the Jews of Eastern Europe and is a mixture of Hebrew, German and Slavic. This remained the case even though David Ben-Gurion once regarded Yiddish as a vessel for the arts, which was produced by Eastern Jews and Germans, and is a language for religious, scientific and political studies in Russia, Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. Despite the role that Yiddish played in the daily lives of Eastern Jews, it became necessary for Zionism to put an end to its significance in order to make way for its political plans, via the Hebrew language. We can trace this phenomenon through Ahad Ha'am's slogan of "the last Jew and the first Hebrew" in his Hebrew writings, which Arthur Koestler repeated in his novel Thieves in the Night in the mid-1940s, which proved to be a clear precursor to the establishment of Israel. As the novel's hero, Joseph, put it, "I became a Hebrew because I hated the Yid." Yael Dayan repeated the same directive in Envy the Frightened, when the character Ivri says, "You are Israeli. I was only a Jew. I left my clothes behind and some of my family, and found a new God." The truth is that Dayan seemed to suffer from the same dilemma, because she is Jewish and writes about Zionist issues in English, a fact that once prompted her to declare that Israelis consider her a national disaster. Finally, we find Israel to be overjoyed with Shmuel Yosef Agnon's Nobel Prize in 1966. The truth is that he is not the best Israeli writer. He did, however, dedicate his talent to promote the adoption of Hebrew as a national language and heaped chauvinistic praise upon it, thereby imbuing his work with an unadulterated Zionist message. It was ineluctable for Zionism, as a fabricated political movement, to weaponize language with such vehemence, an effort only matched by its hostility to social integration against which it presented itself as an alternative. Weaponizing language in this way sharpened the contradiction within the Zionist cause, which wants to amalgamate nationalism with religion into a single concept. The work of the Nobel Prize winner Agnon, for example, cannot be comprehended by an international audience because it features a complex mélange of religious rituals, on the one hand, and a political project on the other. Historically, pre-Zionist Hebrew literature was confined almost exclusively to poetry, especially in the Psalms. The language occupied a purely religious position. It was the language of the Jewish spirit, even during the times when Hebrew ceased to be a complete language. During times when Hebrew was only the language of religion and prayer, and when Jews did not suffer from religious, political, or racist persecution, they chose to use the languages of the societies in which they lived in their philosophical, intellectual, and literary production. Such decisions indicate the natural status of the Hebrew language. In the period between the 9th and 12th centuries in Al-Andalus, for instance, which Jewish historians themselves regard as a golden era under Arab rule, Yehuda Halevi and Solomon ibn Gabirol produced philosophical and intellectual works in Arabic, while, at the same time, composing religious poetry in Hebrew. A similar process occurred during other times of reprieve in the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and the rest of the Western countries, where Hebrew poetry was similarly confined to prayers and other religious rituals. Some of Halavai's poems are suitable for prayers, while others are not, but most are replete with religious sentiments. We take Yehuda Halavai as a case study in this regard because he lived during the Golden Age in Al-Andalus, where he was far removed from the environment of fear and persecution that prevailed elsewhere. He was born in 1086 and lived in Al-Andalus, after which he traveled to Palestine for religious reasons, where he died in 1140. Halavai fully mastered the Arabic language alongside Hebrew, according to the Jewish German poet Heinrich Heine. Yet he used Hebrew in religious poetry only and did not use it in his intellectual work at all, much like his fellow Jewish poet and intellectual Solomon ibn Gabirol, who died in 1070. This reality shows that the connection between Jews and Hebrew had always been non-national in nature. The task of the Hebrew language was to assist in the articulation of religious ideas and interpretation, since the dawn of Jewish history. Though the practice of writing in other languages was a natural custom, this of course does not mean that Jews were not proud of the language. They have always been so, but such pride was always associated with the language's sacred function. This sort of pride is evident in Halavai's decision to select Arabic, i.e., the language of the society in which he lived, to write his tome in defense of Judaism titled Al-Achija wal Dalil fi Nurat al-Din al-Dalil, or the Book of Refutation and Proof on behalf of the misguided religion, which is known in Jewish circles as Khazari. Political Zionism, therefore, utilized this religious phenomenon for political ends that have nothing to do with the religion, singling out the land of Palestine from all the offers on the table at the time to establish a national homeland. Hebrew was the language of the Old Testament and represented the spiritual bridge to the Promised Land. Zionism exploited these facts for its political ends. Suddenly, the status of Hebrew underwent a complete transformation. The Zionist movement threw its entire weight behind the claim that there existed national connotations to Jewish pride, in the language of the sacred religion only. Thus, dubious and illogical new positions arose from the politicization of the Hebrew language, which became the chest key that contains the most valuable of prizes, because the Old Testament is humanity's most effective medicine. The lobbying and disinformation efforts pressed on, the revisionist account of which went on to claim that Hebrew did not only manage to survive for centuries, because it was a language of rituals, but because it represented a state, of sorts. The situation continued to escalate at an alarming rate through the deliberate distortion of the facts. As part of the cultural movement that was fabricated to facilitate conquest, Menachem Ribelo added that Palestine lived in the heart of the Jew through poetic imagery. This is what was present in the Psalms, and what became the Jews' daily bread. This hypothesis became an avenue for political Zionism's falsifications, whereby a language of religious affairs was made to bear an even heavier burden beyond any logic. Suddenly, religious rituals themselves were turned into catalysts of a political cause. According to this narrative, Jews have never ceased to believe, across the generations, that this language will be reborn. For them, Hebrew was not merely the language of the past, but of the future, the language of rebirth, the language that enables the Jewish people to remain as a single people. Such political instrumentalization of a traditional religious matter, which never meant what Goldberg wanted it to mean, forgets that many Jews did not actually know Hebrew, and that they uttered Hebrew words during their prayers without knowing their meaning. This can be noted in how David Bakken, a professor of psychology at Missouri University, for instance, remembers his grandfather, Itzhak Yosef Rosenstrach, performing his prayers in memorized Hebrew which he did not understand. This indicates the truth of the matter, that such rituals were not more than religious mysticism of a specific brand, and goes against the idea that Hebrew was preserved to enable the Jewish people to remain as a single people. Ben-Gurion himself confirms this when he says that Hebrew was the language of non-speakers that lived in the hearts because it was the language of prayers, poetry, and religious literature. It is doubtless, however, that such falsification represented more than mere instrumentalization of Hebrew for a new and urgent task. It also served to distort the representations of the Jewish character in the literature that was to follow. Turning Hebrew into a national language changed its literary content as well. This was reflected in Jewish literary characters, where a religious character of mystical lore and moral fortitude became a political one, despite being unable to rid himself of his antiquated mythological roots. This change in the character of the Hebrew language distorted the relationship between Jewish and Hebrew heroes, according to the terminology of Ahad Ha'am and the inheritors of his slogan. The classical Jewish character had practically disappeared from Jewish literature during the long centuries that followed the collapse of the ancient Jewish statelet in Palestine until the birth of the Zionist movement. That hero was subsequently replaced by the Hebrew character, once more, which appeals to the legends of the Old Testament, only this time, he is without a god, a predestined fate or spiritual objectives. In a ludicrously quixotic manner, the Jewish literary character now represents absolute power and purity. Reuben Wallenrod explains that the reason for the absence of heroism in Hebrew stories of the diaspora is that the writers found no aim in sight for their characters. The old goals had crumbled away and there were no new ones to replace them. This is an analysis that wants to ultimately justify the Zionist message by deliberately distorting the facts. The Jewish hero was not actually absent during the period of wandering. Such a hero did exist, but it was articulated in religious terms because Hebrew literature was confined to religious purposes. What Zionism has done, in this context, is instrumentalize that character in the political arena by rendering that old mythology in a form that resembles a psychological complex rather than a real human being. Merging the religious with the political dimensions could not produce a better result than what can be found in Exodus, where the hero embodies absolute virtue physiologically, psychologically, and politically, a little more than a joke, if critiqued from a purely technical point of view. Yet, Wallenrod carries on, today, the fiction of Israel has given us heroes once more, that is, at the expense of the artistic value, sincerity, and legitimacy of the work. All of the above summarizes the details, which will be discussed in the coming pages, of Zionist literature's positions on the land of Palestine, along with race and religion, which are often amalgamated into a single concept, and its opposition to social integration into other societies. These questions will test Zionist literature's message, the results of which resemble a farce, as we will see. This is a literature that claims to be opposed to racist oppression while representing a contemporary example of yet another brand of it from the opposite direction. Zionism deals with this contradiction in a fraudulent manner. On the one hand, it views the world's growing consciousness of human rights as the catalyst that changed the religious character of the Jews, which for many generations had manifested itself through prayer and pleading to metaphysical powers, until Jewish identity took a political and national character instead. But on the other hand, the world's growing consciousness is a force that actually pushes toward the social integration of its communities, and not toward fabricating tenuous nationalisms. Indeed, never in the history of the world has religious tolerance ever turned a religion into a nationalism. The opposite is the case, because such tolerance allows religious minorities to attain citizenship rights in the nations in which they reside. The truth is that the Jewish experience did not change on its own, nor did it change as a result of the world's increasing consciousness of its rights. Rather, it was compelled to change, almost by force, which affected not only how Jews view other peoples, but also how other peoples view Judaism as a religion. Even before its official birth, the Zionist movement constantly resisted the calls for integration, as championed by some Jews during times of reprieve. This situation yielded grave consequences, which will be reflected in Zionist literary production, as we will see. Chapter 2. The birth of Zionist literature. Zionism, i.e., the Jewish political movement targeting Palestine, was not born at the conference in Basel on August 29, 1897. This event was nothing more than a public crowning of a series of lobbying efforts, in which Zionist literature had played a fundamental role. While it is true that the end of the 19th century witnessed the official birth of political Zionism, its literary counterpart preceded that period. It was the latter that produced the material that ultimately comprised intellectual Zionism, as per the writings of Moses Hess, Leon Pinsker, Nahum Sokolow, Ahad Ha'am, Theodor Herzl, and others. A few initial observations are worth making. The pinnacle of Zionist literary production was reached at a time when Jews attained citizenship rights in their countries of residence. Crucially, this was also precisely the period during which the ideas that would later represent the bedrock of Zionism were developed. This seems like a strange development that contradicts the received wisdom, which holds that it was anti-Jewish oppression that drove Jews toward adopting a sense of superiority, whereby a political rediscovery of the Promised Land becomes a vehicle for self-reliance, salvation, and reclamation of dignity. But studying Zionist literature, overall, shows that the complete opposite was true. Indeed, the best, and most original, works of Jewish literary production originated within the framework of the Jewish diaspora, during times of reprieve. During periods when Jews enjoyed an almost complete sense of freedom, which extended for several centuries, i.e., 1751–038, the most significant Jewish names gained prominence in the intellectual and religious fields. This was the period when Jews achieved what they regard to be the completion of the field of theological codification that continues to feature in contemporary Jewish life. Yet, this was also a time when Jews completed the writing of the Talmud, a book containing bloody violence, hatred, and extremism, and when the idea of the return to the Promised Land spread for the first time, if on religious grounds. The Jews experienced their golden age under Arab rule in Al-Andalus. During this time Yehuda Halevi produced his religious poetry, which Jews regard as among the finest in their literary history, as well as his tome, which came to be regarded as a landmark religious work, i.e., Kuzari. Point 2. It was also during this era, under Arab rule in Al-Andalus, Morocco and Egypt, that Jews attained their full rights. This was when Saadiya ben Yosef Jayan, 892–1103, made his Talmudic and philosophical contribution and produced the first Arabic translation of the Old Testament in Egypt. It was when Isaac al-Fasai, 1012–1103, wrote his philosophical work in Arabic, and when Moses ben Maimon, known in the West as Maimonides, who is considered a prominent figure in Judaic history, produced his religious and philosophical works. One may also recount the number of prominent Jewish names that established the foundations of Judaic thought during times of reprieve, such as Hasdai ibn Shaprut, 961, Samuel Honeged, Solomon ibn Gabaral's mentor, and others. When the Islamic State was extended to the east during the middle of the 7th century, Islam acknowledged Judaism and granted the Jews all the rights they had enjoyed under the most tolerant Persian states. Jews in these places produced advanced religious, philosophical, and literary studies at a time when their Western European counterparts experienced sheer intellectual impotence, during the oppressive period of the Middle Ages. When a few names did become prominent during periods of oppression, their work did not represent more than extensions of what had already been produced during periods of reprieve and tolerance. The Jews of Spain and southern France, who experienced a period of oppression following the Arab retreat from Al-Andalus, followed Maimonides' thought and extended it. The same dynamic can be observed in the period of oppression that followed Rashi's interpretation of the Talmud, in the second half of the 12th century, after which it remained a point of reference. Toward the end of the 15th century, the world's Jews could not have found a safer and more tolerant place than Constantinople. Before long, 30,000 Jews who had fled the oppression in Europe arrived there, after nearly 1,000 years. The Jewish Cultural Center in Palestine was reinvigorated thanks to the tolerance of the rulers of Constantinople, through which those fleeing Eastern and Central Europe found their way to Safed, where they established a productive center for studies that produced the likes of Joseph Caro, 1488, and Isaac Luria, 1532. During this period, Poland also became a Jewish cultural center, thanks to the improvement of the conditions of the Jewish population there. It supported the religious Jewish culture of Germany, where a wave of persecution was underway. But due to what is known as the Cossack massacres, Poland ceased to be such a center for Jews and was displaced by the Netherlands due to its tolerant environment. This, after all, was where Baruch Spinoza, 1632–1677, produced his excellent works, along with Manasseh ben Israel, 1604–1657, whose religious and literary work exhibited early signs of originality. The 18th century was a special time of reprieve for the Jewish population of Germany, thanks to the development of the outlook of its Christian intellectuals, led by Christian Wolff, as well as the novelist and historian Jacques Bastani, who wrote the famous play Nathan the Wise. The influence of these two personalities led to the improvement of the social and political conditions of the German Jewish community. Yet, this situation provoked a reaction against assimilation and social integration. This can be noted in how Moses Mendelssohn's 1729–1786 translation of the Jewish Bible into German was received. The translation was intended as an effort to help the Jewish community to assimilate into German society, but it failed due to a ferocious campaign by racists who refused to be regarded as equal to other peoples. Under such pressure, Mendelssohn's translation of the Old Testament did not lead to the desired outcome, but drew new Jewish readers toward German literary circles instead of the dissemination of the Old Testament, in German, among Jews. The subsequent chauvinism turned Mendelssohn into a champion of the very cause he sought to fight. On October 27, 1791, the French National Assembly granted unconditional rights to the Jewish citizens of France. The phenomenon spread to Western and Central Europe. But instead of nurturing the drive for social integration, the power represented by a class of Jews with special economic and financial privileges was, to a large extent, used to exert pressure in the opposite direction, that is, in the direction of racism and extremism. The empowerment of Jewish communities was confronted by that privileged class on flimsy religious and racist grounds. This led to a critical development in Jewish history. It split the spiritual and civil authorities in the Jewish communities into a religious order, and another made up of a socio-economically privileged class, which advanced a Jewish supremacist position, often on religious grounds. During this period, a reformist school was established in Germany as a result of the fierce battle between the two camps, in which old religious texts were revisited. The intellectual writings of Samson Raphael Hirsch, 1808–1888, discussed modernizing Judaism through integration into European culture. But such calls were always confronted by an opposing camp that was represented, to some degree, by Abraham Geiger. It was also during this time that Israel Held Schemer established the Orthodox Institute for Religious Studies in Berlin, before an anti-Semitic wave developed there toward the end of the 19th century. The Jewish communities of Eastern Europe enjoyed a period of relative freedom between the years 1815 and 1855, which gave rise to what Jews call Haskalah, or enlightenment, and reinvigorated Hebrew literature in Poland and Russia. And in the second half of the 19th century, the conditions of Jewish communities improved in England, leading to an increase in Jewish cultural production, which took on a racist character at the hands of the socio-economically privileged Jewish class, as we will see. The fact, then, is that oppression was not what gave rise to the Zionist movement. The opposite seems to be closer to the truth. Times of reprieve could have served as openings for integration, but such opportunities were spurned by a specific class of Jews on racist and chauvinistic grounds. It is striking how the roles of the oppressor and the oppressed were reversed in these cases. The racist Jewish position was mostly represented by Jewish men who enjoyed special privileges at the expense of the oppressed Jewish minorities. Jewish history proves that the creative periods of Jewish self-assertion were times free from persecution. Virtually all the great Jewish classics, the works which in their sum total represent the Jewish heritage, originated in times of Jewish prosperity and freedom from persecution and oppression. If Jewish heritage, or what Weiss Rosmarin called Jewish self-assertion, was established during times of reprieve, then calls for such conditions should have been the message of the Zionist movement. But the movement took the opposite position, for racist purposes, by claiming Jewish superiority and refusing to integrate, which in turn always contributed to undermining the prospects of coexistence. Consequently, these positions not only refute the recurring claim in Zionist literature that Israel was a part of the response to oppression, but also reveals the reason behind the bind in which the Zionist novelist constantly finds himself, to feel a constant need to justify Israel, and to adopt racist positions toward that end. Such racism has a long history. It represented a negative response to the Jewish question, which it never intended to resolve. The oppressed Jewish communities were confronted with two mutually exclusive possibilities: to either endure the pain of the struggle for equality and social integration, or to cling to claims of superiority and the myth of exceptionalism, with the latter being a mere inversion of the same racist ideology that persecuted the Jews. Jewish history has witnessed appeals for integration, through its struggle for full civil rights, as much as it had appeals for racism behind the guise of the myth of God's chosen people. But the Zionist movement managed to besiege and obliterate the proponents of integration thanks to its limitless resources, establishing in its place a negative Judaism at the heart of which lies a psychological complex which would be exploited to the furthest possible extent. No one has the right to demand that Jews be martyrs of human stupidity. But the conditions of the modern age have widened the scope of human rights and enlightened the world's collective consciousness. Had Zionism employed its effective methods and limitless resources in a positive manner, it would have achieved for the Jews a status similar to that which they enjoy in the United States, for example, the social integration into which Nahum Goldman regarded to be a Jewish obligation in 1965. Hebrew literature was, indeed, by and large a religious literature. Religious sentiments, as they appeared in ancient texts, may seem to be extremist and chauvinistic in certain contexts. This may not seem reprehensible, if historicized. What is truly reprehensible, however, is the instrumentalization of a bygone era's claims of exceptionalism, which do not fundamentally carry a univocal meaning, to serve a political Zionist objective, and to meticulously search for whatever seems to be conducive to that purpose in ways that could not have possibly occurred to the original authors. Contemporary Zionist studies on Hebrew literature are fixated on Maimonides' will to his son, where he wrote, "My son, I know the sin I have sinned against my people, and I pray to God that I may be found worthy to return the stolen article to its rightful owners and to translate my books into the sacred tongue." Zionists deem this document as supportive of their case, regardless of the content of the rest of Maimonides' work and the circumstances that made it possible. Yehuda Halevi, on the other hand, only wrote religious poetry and composed at least 700 psalms for the synagogue. Zionism has worked hard to politicize his poem My Heart is in the East, where he wrote, Zion lieth beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains? More ambiguous lines have received a similar treatment in My Journey to Zion, which could not have possibly been political in intent. Zionism dedicated its energies to this front because it represented a penetrable point in the spiritual Jewish home, and a fabricated connecting tissue between religion and nationalism. But such negative pressures were not restricted to this arena. They also extended to the social arena. Just as a racist current confronted Mendelssohn when he translated the Old Testament to German, lest it help integrate the Jews into German society, racist Jews organized demonstrations in the Netherlands at the end of the 18th century when Jews were given the same civil liberties, socially, religiously, and politically as the Dutch. The racist current opposed the rights and the equality these liberties entailed because they feared that Judaism would suffer from the great freedom of the Jews and from their new duties. But the truth is that this was essentially an opposition to opening the door to integration. The ideas of superiority and distinction have always played a role in preventing assimilation. The constant lobbying efforts of the racist Jewish current contributed to the maturation of this tendency, at the expense of another tendency which viewed equality and then social integration to be the solution to the question. Literature played an important role in serving this purpose, whereby the partisans of racism deepened its role by insisting on using it as a means to disseminate their views. As Heine wrote in 1854, I now see that the Greeks were only handsome youths, whilst the Jews were always men, powerful, indomitable men. The promotion of this position would carry on for almost exactly a century, eventually giving rise to the infallible Jewish character, which Leon Uris took to the extreme in Exodus. This occurred not only at the expense of one's ethics, but at the expense of artistic technique as well. As we will see, this current increasingly grew in literature and carried with it the seeds of Zionism. We will likewise detect this current at play in the legend of the Wandering Jew, which was removed from its religious context, along with its metaphysical relationship with persecution and punishment, and was turned into a tale of superiority and distinction. The character's wandering and his concomitant torments came to be regarded as the price of superiority, as Jews would become, through torment, better Jews with more Jewish hearts. We will see that constant pressures will render this position as a fact, to a degree that would make Sigmund Freud, 1856–1939, write a long response to one of his friends, who asked to be advised on whether to provide his son with a Jewish upbringing or to assimilate him into Christian schools, in which he says, "If you do not want your son to grow up as a Jew, you would deprive him of all irreplaceable sources of vitality. He would have to struggle as a Jew, and you would have to cultivate within him every energy he would need for that struggle. Do not deprive him of this characteristic." Freud himself believed that the Jewish sense of pride and superiority was based on the idea of a God's chosen people, which was spread by Moses in ancient times among the Jews. He also attributed anti-Semitism to the envy with which ancient peoples met the Jews, because Jesus was born among them. This belief, in addition to being entirely devoid of an analytical basis, does not explain the reasons for the Jewish sense of superiority. Freud circles around it until he reaches a complete confession. Moses created a character for Jews when he gave them a religion that gave them confidence to such a degree that they came to believe to be superior to all other peoples. They survived as a result of this superiority. We can note that Freud here insisted on saying a result of this superiority rather than a result of their feeling of superiority. What undergirds such an articulation will turn that Jewish ability to survive into an ability to violently invade, i.e., armed with such claims of superiority. There was a certain racist current, then, that pushed towards a negative Judaism and inverted the same racist ideology that persecuted the Jews, while silencing other Jewish voices that were actually interested in resolving the Jewish question through a civil rights struggle, social integration, and a separation between Judaism and Jewish nationalism. Zionism ultimately employed its vast resources for the domination of Zionist literature, which was expressed in the evolution of the Jewish literary figure since the 19th century up to the present moment. The character started as the Davidian, religious figure, then moved to the Shylokian character, after which we find the doubter, followed by the complainer, the conqueror, and finally the political David, who rather resembles a psychological complex, a figure of absolute power, virtue, and infallibility, before whom the entire world appears like the ghost of Goliath. Chapter 3. Race and Religion in Zionist Literature beget Political Zionism. The conditions of European Jews saw an improvement at the start of the 19th century. We can say that this improvement was consistent and progressive, despite the episodic relapses that may be regarded as secondary in an otherwise upward trajectory. By 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte planted the seed of the idea of equality in France and the parts of Europe that he managed to reach. Soon the idea spread further and was put into practice, at least partially. It was also during this period, in 1811, that the reformist Jewish movement was established in Germany. Influenced by the ideas that Bonaparte had spread, the movement called for the promotion of Judaism as a religion and a culture in line with the times. Between 1815 and 1855, the Hebrew language enjoyed a new lease of life in Eastern Europe, where language schools were established for that very purpose. And in the second half of the 19th century, large numbers of Jews migrated to Western Europe and the United States, where they achieved a degree of relative privilege, especially in England. This phenomenon was reflected clearly in the ebbs and flows of Jewish literary production in that period. While opportunities for social integration and assimilation were increasing, we can nevertheless note a rising chauvinistic current among socio-economically privileged Jewish circles. The constant stream of Zionist literature that began to appear by the middle of the century finally broke into the mainstream by the century's end, leading up to the consolidation of political Zionism at the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. During this period, the Jewish hero began to take on a new shape in European literature, articulating the Jewish question as an existential one. Nonetheless, chauvinistic pressure was pushing toward framing the matter as a national question. The world's increasingly enlightened consciousness created an opportunity to revisit the Jewish question on an objective basis. But what happened was the opposite. At the beginning of the 19th century, Jewish literary characters ceased to be modeled after the Shylokian archetype, not only as a result of the enfranchisement of influential sections of the European Jewish community, but also due to the ascendancy of an enlightened consciousness in Europe which championed a modern cultural current that was anti-racist, on principle. The truth is that many European and Jewish writers during that time advanced various Jewish characters that seemed to gesture at possible beginnings of a resolution to the Jewish question. Such characters were rejected by the chauvinistic Jewish tendency, which continued to peddle the superior and infallible hero. We will observe this current more clearly when studying the character of the wandering Jew and its development across various literary works. This archetype emerged in a particular time frame to pose a specific question, which constantly paved the way for literature on the political Jewish destiny. The wandering Jew was thus transformed from a symbol of religious persecution to a political adventurer, with the right to question God himself and prove to him the fundamental immorality of his persecution. In light of the increasing civil liberties that were afforded to Jewish communities, as well as the opportunities for social integration, the chauvinistic and racist current pushed toward political Zionism. The increasing influence of the socio-economically privileged section of these communities was thus instrumentalized toward that political end. English literature is a perfect and comprehensive case in point. At the start of the 19th century, the Jewish population in the British Isles did not exceed 8,000 and their conditions were not characterized by privilege of any sort. Their relationship with British society was nevertheless better than their European counterparts in their respective states. During the first half of the century, the position of the Jewish character changed slightly in English literature, and the few cases that contradict this trend were exceptions that do not refute it. Only after noting this phenomenon can one understand the extreme hostility with which Maria Edgeworth's novel Harrington, published in 1817, was met. It was perceived that its representation of Jewish characters broke the traditional and once prevalent mold in English literature. This novel was, in the opinion of most English literary critics, the first to depict a virtuous Jewish character. Harrington was an innovative intervention that reflected an increasingly enlightened global consciousness that rejected racism. It retains a special importance for that reason. But within 16 years of the novel's publication, the English and Jewish Benjamin Disraeli wrote The Wondrous Tale of Elroy, which attacked Harrington's Jewish hero for paving the way for social integration. Disraeli's hero, on the other hand, proposed a violent brand of racism that would come to represent the other side of the bloody Hitlerian coin a century later. The second part of the 19th century witnessed key developments in the form of a rich British cultural production that explored the Jewish character on humanistic terms, according to which the Shylockian character that once dominated English literature for centuries was categorically rejected. This new phenomenon reflected the qualitative change in the relationship between Jews and their respective societies. It was possible for such developments to offer an opening for a genuine resolution to the Jewish question, were it not for the chauvinism that confronted them at every turn on behalf of certain Jewish circles. The evolution of English literature vis-a-vis the Jewish hero was, therefore, not mere happenstance. It was the culmination of a history of pressures, key among which was the increasing enlightenment and the diffusion of the principles of human rights. Meanwhile, a certain development was taking place against this backdrop in the English Jewish community, which was beginning to enjoy social and economic advancement thanks to the stream of migration from abroad, accompanied by migration to London specifically. We may regard the middle of the 19th century as a turning point. In 1858, Lionel de Rothschild became the first Jewish member of British Parliament in history. The rise of de Rothschild reflected increasing Jewish influence. It was followed by another precedent, as London had its first Jewish mayor in 1880. Around the same time, Benjamin Disraeli became Prime Minister twice. By 1900 the Jewish population in Britain reached 250,000, a third of whom lived in London. A concomitant development was taking place. There was a change in the character of the literature that discussed the Jewish question. We will see later that the second half of the 19th century will bring a final turning point toward politicizing the Jewish character in that literature. Two notable books can be placed within this broad framework. The first is the aforementioned novel, Harrington, and the second is Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott, published in 1819. Their significance lies in the fact that they employed virtuous Jewish characters at such an early period of the history of the English novel. Yet what may seem like exceptional circumstances leading to such literary developments were actually a natural reflection of the increasing sense of enlightenment and anti-racism on the part of these novels' readership. Despite being the first English novel that portrayed its virtuous Jewish characters in a serious manner, and despite having critically engaged with anti-Semitism, Harrington broke Maria Edgeworth's own mold as well. After having depicted Jewish characters along the prevailing stereotypes of the time, Harrington represented an attempt at redemption on the author's part. About a year prior to publication, Edgeworth received an extremely well-written letter from a Jewish American girl called Rachel Mordecai, which protested the portrayal of Jewish characters in the author's previous novels. Although Jewish critics are inclined to believe that this letter played an important role in influencing the author, a more objective reading would posit that the writer was responding to a growing cultural trend that sought to resolve the Jewish question on an anti-racist basis. Jewish critics, however, tend to view Harrington as an apology for a mistake that only came as a result of Jewish pressure. Such a view robs the author of her agency. A similar pattern repeated itself with Ivanhoe, 1819, which was seen as the first English novel to offer a popular depiction of Jews. In the 1894 letters of Sir Walter Scott, on the other hand, we find the author to be fixated on denigrating the Jews. It seems that Scott's relationship with them was strictly financial, as he frequently marveled at their ability to earn such wealth and described them as being adept lenders. Other parts of his letters suggest that he might have fallen into the hands of Jewish debtors, who pursued him relentlessly and enraged him. Thus Jewish critics are inclined to suggest that the character of Rebecca in Ivanhoe represented an attempt at mediation, of sorts, between the author and his Jewish debtors. This suggestion lacks an objective basis. Writers do not write novels to simply apologize, and Ivanhoe, whose character Rebecca contradicts the author's beliefs about Jews, could have only been the author's capitulation to an objective social tendency that rejected racism. Yet the apology thesis is common among some critics, where the matter is taken for granted. When such critics fail to find such an apology to score a victory for the purported Jewish position, the novelist would likely be ignored. The chauvinists' insistence on distorting such significant moments reflects their desire to establish a premise for a political Jewish hero that rejects integration as a resolution to the Jewish question. Thus, it was necessary to invent a Jewish character of a different mold than the romantic ones of Harrington and Ivanhoe. Benjamin Disraeli, himself an English Jewish-born political personality of considerable influence and privilege, invented such a literary character so blatantly in 1833 as per the requirements of the chauvinists. Sir Walter Scott and Maria Edgeworth brought about a qualitative shift in English literature's position on Jews and affirmed the romantic Jewish characters that Shelley and Byron had formulated around the turn of that century. Disraeli, on the other hand, as a proponent of the racist position, served the ambitions of the chauvinistic and extremist Jewish circles by transforming the romantic character into a political national one, thereby delivering a blow to the proponents of social integration. Disraeli authored The Wondrous Tale of Ulroy in 1833 before becoming Britain's Prime Minister. That this novel is often overlooked is suspicious enough. The novel is, in any case, pertinent both in its own right and due to its consequential impact. Here, Disraeli showcases a Jewish Zionist hero around half a century before the official birth of the Zionist movement in Basel, where he rejects any chance for social integration. This is the same racist and extremist position that finally meets its downfall 80 years later, after it was adopted in its inverted form by Adolf Hitler. In order to reject the romantic Jewish hero, and along with it the idea of social integration, Disraeli had to offer an alternative solution which, at this early historical stage of Zionism, was stunningly clear: racism. Disraeli took the claim of Jewish superiority, which represented a survival attribute according to Freud, to its inevitable conclusion by turning it into a conquering force. Rejecting integration necessitated one of two possibilities: to either assume a position of inferiority or that of superiority. Having rejected integration, Disraeli was compelled to choose the racist position. The sense of superiority and distinction that surrounds the Jewish hero in the wondrous tale of Elroy was crudely racist. Disraeli paints the entire world with the same grotesque Hitlerian brush: race is all, there is no other truth. He insisted that even what people may regard as an individual action is in fact a racial characteristic. Recall that this was a time when opportunities for integration were available. Disraeli pushed in the opposite direction instead. In reality, you cannot obliterate a pure race, it's a psychological fact. It's a simple law of nature. He declares, across pages and pages of this exhilarating novel, that the Hebrew is an unmixed race. This novel was written and published at a time when Disraeli sat at the very top of the politically and economically privileged class of Jews, not long after which he ascended to the position of Prime Minister, which signified both that the Jewish question was on the path toward resolution and the extremists' rejection of it. Disraeli said a lot more than he should have in the wondrous tale of Elroy. Revealing the truth of the racist ambitions of the extremist Jews provoked a wide-ranging reaction. One critic commented on the novel by pointing out that Disraeli was effectively saying that Jews are ordained on historical and religious grounds to assume the moral and intellectual leadership of the universe. All the same, Disraeli steered clear of explicitly declaring Palestine as a national homeland for the Jews. Nonetheless, his mixing of race and religion did target Palestine as a spiritual center, in an astonishing and peculiar manner. In any case, what Disraeli did was more damaging than what he did not do. He introduced a Zionist hero for the first time instead of a solely Jewish one. Upon publication, extremist Jews took the opportunity to correct what Disraeli said while highlighting and embellishing what he did not say. As part of the widespread discussion in the British press, George Eliot expressed her disgust with Disraeli's character of Sidonia and her boasting of her racial purity and superiority. We will see shortly that this is the same George Eliot who maintained a close relationship with Jewish extremists, having been inspired to write her lengthy Daniel Deronda against the wondrous tale of Elroy. In that novel, Eliot rejected the sense of racism to which Sidonia appealed. The novel also rectifies Disraeli's Zionism by regarding Palestine as a politically expedient means of gathering Jews from the diaspora. This claim, which has since become ubiquitous, was enshrined here as a principle of Zionism, i.e., that Zionism represents a response to racism and antisemitism. It is a position that conceals the essence of Zionism, which counters racist oppression with racism. Daniel Deronda will be discussed later, but let us trace the rising tide of Jewish characters in English literature for now, where a strange phenomenon can be observed. In 1856, Charles Reade wrote "It is never too late to mend," which was not of any special significance, per se, except in that it represented a turning point for Jewish characters in the literature. Reade's hero vacillates between virtue and vice, self-importance and triviality, and, in clearer terms, between social integration and exceptionalism, as though he was preparing himself for an imminent transformation. Reade's hero is a man of dignity whose motto is "an eye for an eye." But he is also a mysterious figure who denounces people through a Shylockian prism. In short, he represents the very turning point that Eliot would advance, thanks to Disraeli's influence, toward a racist position. Consider the following: a number of prominent books were published in 1838, among others of lesser stature, whose Jewish characters fit the Shylockian mold, including Oliver Twist and Layla. In 1848, George Eliot critiqued the racist premise upon which Disraeli authored The Wondrous Tale of Elroy. In 1856, Charles Reade wrote his novel whose hero stood bemused between the Jewish characters of the day, as in Ivanhoe and Harrington, and those of The Wondrous Tale of Elroy. Later in 1876, George Eliot wrote Daniel Deronda, which finally established the Jewish Zionist hero in English literature and thus contributed to increasing the numbers of pro-Zionist publications. This crescendo of events was accompanied by another process on the societal level. The Jewish population in England increased from 8,000 to 250,000, as did the opportunities for integration along with political and economic influence. Daniel Deronda's hero, Mordecai, represents a non-combatant figure, who will take a precisely delineated journey and reappear once more in the 1950s under the name of Ben-Ari in Exodus. Daniel Deronda is especially important because it established an actual premise for the Jewish Zionist hero in the literature. The novel opened the door to a stream of others that followed Eliot's lead in crafting their Jewish characters. As such, the Jewish group in Daniel Deronda remain the most distinguished Jewish names in the English novel to date. Eliot's accomplishment was that she established a Zionist action plan when she made her characters believe in contributing to the creation of the future of the world and of the Jewish people. Her work promoted awareness of the value of heritage and tradition, and the political significance of pivoting toward Palestine. Mordecai, in this way, became a legendary proselytizer, a political man, and social prophet. He speaks of nothing but the Jewish state, and finds no suitable alternatives elsewhere. In fact, Mordecai succeeds in doing exactly what Sidonia had done in the wondrous tale of Elroy in a far more sophisticated manner, because the former avoided the trappings of Disraeli's overt racism. Mordecai thus employs a ruse, as he skillfully affirms that the idea of God's chosen people actually means that the Jews were chosen by God for the sake of other people. But this formal eradication of racist content becomes meaningless as the novel's events unfold. Its characters' elaborate maneuvers around the pitfall of racism do not save them from it and its unjustified sense of superiority. Here is contemporary Zionism's political and literary appraisal of Daniel Deronda. The most important layers that created the English legend of the Jew were, in chronological order, the theological, the economic, the romantic, and the realistic. To these four, Daniel Deronda added a fifth layer, the heroic, and in the 3/4 of a century that have elapsed since the appearance of this novel, this layer has come ever more to the fore, establishing the legend of Israel reborn. The more accurate term for heroic should be Zionist, with its refusal to be equated with the rest of the members of society in which Jews reside. Sol Liptzyn's definition of Romanticism highlights the role of Jewish characters in English literature, which for a time featured the angelic Jew, an exotic picturesque figure akin to the gypsy, a saintly sage about whom there was a gleam of past glory and whose daughter was beautiful, kind, and suffering, as in the works of Richard Cumberland, Walter Scott, Byron, Shelley, and others. But none of these writers was interested in the future of the Jews. Defining Romanticism in such terms serves a purpose. Liptzyn states that Romanticism is a foreign representational form based on reviving disguised models that belong to ancient times. But Romanticism was neither a foreign representational form nor a disguised reenactment of ancient ones. Romanticism, rather, rearticulated Judaism as a religion and implicitly demanded the end of its oppression. But the extremists viewed such a development as a threat to their political objectives, which favored a heroism as an expression of national superiority. In any case, what concerns us in Daniel Deronda, which spans over 600 pages, is what critics later dubbed the Zionist section of the novel. This was the part that Henry James, the critic most specialized in George Eliot's work, described as, at bottom, cold, and unreservedly a total failure. Frank Raymond Levis, who wrote the scholarly introduction to the edition of the novel referenced here, believed that the Zionist section of the novel was characterized by an intelligence about the world of her time that had enabled George Eliot to forecast how the passion of nationalism would affect the Jews, while praising the author's immense capacity for intellectual acquisition. Among the most notable features of these chapters is their containing a great deal in the way of fallacious proposition and dubious suggestion, despite the fact that many critics have questioned whether the whole heavy structure of the Jewish question was not built up by the author for the express purpose of giving its proper force to this particular stroke. This perspective tries to represent Eliot as if she had foreseen a historical inevitability. The truth is that she was expanding and affirming an already existing current that chauvinistically rejected the viability of social integration. Eliot did not foresee anything, as Levis would have us believe. Rather, she merely put herself at the service of an already existing agenda and drew an action plan for it. Eliot cast the old Jewish question in Daniel Deronda in a new form and turned its main character Mordecai into a Zionist orator of the first order, as his opinions are not a natural outcome of the novel's series of events but are direct declarations and lectures. These orations in particular were responsible for the popularity of the novel in Zionist circles, as they represented a series of publicized replies to efforts at resolving the Jewish question and high-profile defenses of such oppositional efforts. As such, when Mordecai proceeds to present his point of view across tens of pages, he represents the propagandistic face of a current that wanted to crown Jewish superiority with a nation-state. These parts of the novel, which can only be described as Zionist orations, were those that Henry James regarded as, at bottom, cold. These were an extraneous intervention that are not reflected by means of the narrative of the novel, but rather through direct speech. This is also the reason that prompted some Jewish extremists to dub Daniel Deronda a pro-Zionist publication. If another writer had incorporated such an amount of oratory, their work would certainly be condemned to failure. Eliot's literary ability, however, enabled her to salvage the novel as such without allowing those prolonged orations to obliterate the novel's artistic value entirely. In any case, the difference between Sidonia's racism in The Wondrous Tale of Ulroy and Mordecai's in Daniel Deronda was not as great as Eliot intended. Any neutral reader would easily be able to detect Mordecai's racist position, despite his relative sophistication vis-a-vis Sidonia. It is true, as Jehuda Halevi first said, that Israel is the heart of mankind, if we mean by heart the core of affection which binds a race and its families in dutiful love, and the reverence for the human body which lifts the needs of our animal life into religion. Once more, I say that the effect of our separateness will not be completed and have its highest transformation unless our race takes on again the character of a nationality. That is the fulfillment of the religious trust that molded them into a people, whose life has made half the inspiration of the world. What is it to me that the 10 tribes are lost untraceably, or that multitudes of the children of Judah have mixed themselves with the Gentile populations as a river with rivers? Behold our people still. Their skirts spread afar, they are torn and soiled and trodden on, but there is a jeweled breastplate. Let the wealthy men, the monarchs of commerce, the learned in all knowledge, the skillful in all arts, the speakers, the political counselors, who carry in their veins the Hebrew blood which has maintained its vigor in all climates, and the pliancy of the Hebrew genius for which difficulty means new device, let them say, we will lift up a standard, we will unite in a labor hard but glorious like that of Moses and Ezra, a labor which shall be a worthy fruit of the long anguish whereby our fathers maintained their separateness, refusing the ease of falsehood. They have wealth enough to redeem the soil from debauched and paupered conquerors, they have the skill of the statesman to devise, the tongue of the orator to persuade. And is there no prophet or poet among us to make the ears of Christian Europe tingle with shame at the hideous obloquy of Christian strife, which the Turk gazes at as at the fighting of beasts to which he has lent an arena? There is store of wisdom among us to found a new Jewish polity, grand, simple, just, like the old, A republic where there is equality of protection, an equality which shone like a star on the forehead of our ancient community, and gave it more than the brightness of Western freedom amid the despotisms of the East. Then our race shall have an organic center, a heart and brain to watch and guide and execute. The outraged Jew shall have a defense in the court of nations, as the outraged Englishman of America. And the world will gain as Israel gains. For there will be a community in the van of the East which carries the culture and the sympathies of every great nation in its bosom. There will be a land set for a halting place of enmities, a neutral ground for the East as Belgium is for the West. Difficulties? I know there are difficulties. But let the spirit of sublime achievement move in the great among our people, and the work will begin. This excerpt fully summarizes Mordecai's Zionism and clearly shows that George Eliot did not foresee anything. She was involved in drawing an action plan to convert Jews to Zionism and to exploit the superiority complex as much as possible. Theodor Herzl did the same about half a century later in his novel The Old New Land, which was a precursor to the birth of political Zionism at his hands, and which was more sophisticated than Eliot, much like how Eliot had been more sophisticated than Disraeli, in maneuvering around the racist nature of the cause by trying to dress it up in a humanistic garb. The mixing of race and religion seems to be at its clearest point in Eliot's text. This practice, as can be noted from the excerpt above, confounds two unrelated matters. It claims that race is a spiritual bond before leaping into a discussion about the national character, as if this triad is perfectly synonymous. Then comes the discussion of anti-Jewish oppression, to which a solution by way of a non sequitur is suggested, to assume the role of the humanist pioneer in an arena of beasts, instead of calling for breaking the chains of oppression. During a turning point in the history of European Jews, Daniel Deronda was aligned with the ideologues of chauvinism by taking the Jewish literary character to the realm of adventure and conquest, turning him into a racist hero. This led to a critical transition, as, with writers as different as Charles Reade and George Eliot, we reach a time when the Jew is impeccable. The word impeccability here is nothing but a synonym for racism. The Jewish literary character thus lost the support of his God, much like the impeccable Jews of the Old Testament, which rendered this impeccable proselytizer an insufferable and indefensible ideologue in Exodus in 1958. Daniel Deronda's value lay in its political services for a chauvinistic current at a turning point in history, and whose leaders regarded the book as extremely valuable. Thus they adopted, distributed, and republished the novel across Europe. Within 4 years of its publication, a new school of theorists in Russia, Peretz, Gordon, Smolinsky, and Lilienblum, changed its position on social integration by adopting national political restoration as a resolution to the Jewish question. Thus, these writers at once made Daniel Deronda their own, translated it into Hebrew, and supplemented it by their own views on the recolonization of Palestine. The book invaded Jewish homes, as planned, and became a Zionist Bible after its translation into Hebrew. Later in 1948, Israel named one of its roads in Tel Aviv after George Eliot while the flames of the Palestinian catastrophe were still ablaze. Chapter 4. The Birth and Development of the Character of the Wandering Jew. The character of the wandering Jew in Europe presents us with a more light-hearted representation of the Jewish literary character in popular culture, and sheds light on the relationship between the development of this character in accordance with the social, financial, and religious conditions of European Jews at the time. Tracing the wandering Jew in the literature also reveals the racist political efforts to steer the legitimate concerns that surrounded the Jewish question away from humanistic solutions in favor of racism and chauvinism. In the past, the wandering Jew orbited the religious context that conceived it. It was a character that vacillated between the positions of guilt and malcontent, the sinner and the afflicted, and bad and good omens. These positions spontaneously reflected both the positive and negative changes in the social and religious relations between Jews and Europeans, which were characterized by chauvinism as well as enlightenment at various historical junctures. Yet the wandering Jew was never a political messenger, until the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, when the racist currents undermined the popular ingenuity that had, for better or worse, regarded the cause of the wandering Jew to be that of a subversive and helpless religion. The wandering Jew took the same journey as the wondrous tale of Ulroy and Daniel Deronda's heroes by making the question of ethnicity and religion into one of race under the aegis of a myth of superiority. The character of the wandering Jew stems from ancient religious origins, though it goes back further still because it embodies, at its root and philosophical base, the age-old human bewilderment before the dilemma of mortality and its escape into mythology. What concerns us about the legend of the wandering Jew, however, is not its ancient historical past, but the mainstream form it came to assume. Naturally, the legend reflected not only the socio-economic conditions of the Jews but also the position of the Church toward them. The legend, therefore, often reflected the conditions of the age that produced it. It appeared at times, when the Church represented it, as a topic of obedience or religious sin. The legend was mostly absent during enlightened times. It was frequently utilized to serve specific purposes and often disappeared with the disappearance of Jewish minorities. We can trace the social conditions of the Jews by tracing the legend of the wandering Jew. He was downtrodden, acquiescent, and religious, at times. In other instances, he was a vagrant who spelled bad luck and devastation. He could either be poor or studded with jewels. He may be resigned to the punishment that had been meted out to him at first, but he would soon grow skeptical, querulous, and pugnacious. Ultimately, he becomes a subversive rebel as he eventually shakes his fist at God. Among the legend's first recorded instances in the European belief system can be found in the welter of the Crusades, especially in the Levant. The legend seemed to circulate among peoples and areas that were directly affected by the conquest and was a purely religious phenomenon. The legend made its way to the West in 1228 through an Armenian archbishop who participated in a priestly synod in St. Albans, England. According to Joseph Gayer, tales of the wandering Jew had spread in Europe following the return of the First Regiment of Crusaders in 1110. But the first recorded instance of this character appeared in the tale of the Armenian archbishop's volume The History of St. Albans, in 1228. The archbishop claimed to have seen Noah's Ark from one of the peaks of Armenia's mountains. There, he was asked whether he knew of the man who witnessed the crucifixion of Christ and who was condemned to wander the earth until the day of judgment. The archbishop's response was remarkable. He said, following a momentary pause, "Strange that you should ask this of me. For shortly before I left Armenia this man, Joseph by name, dined with me." The priest went on to tell the tale as he had heard it from the hapless man. He had wandered for about 12 centuries. His name was Cartaphilus during the time of Christ, when he worked as a doorman at the very courthouse that issued the crucifixion sentence. As Christ was leaving its hall, Cartaphilus tapped Christ on his back and cried, "Go faster, Jesus, go faster. Why do you loiter?" Christ responded calmly, "I am going, but you shall wait until I return." Since then, Cartaphilus had not ceased to wander the earth as a quiet and wretched man in constant hope for forgiveness, having committed a sin of ignorance, because Christ said on the cross, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." 3 centuries after the recording of this tale, the wandering Jew was said to have appeared in Bohemia in 1505, where he helped a man called Kokot to find his grandfather's hidden treasure. 20 years later, he appeared for a third time in Germany to Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa in the guise of a sorcerer. The character is said to have made an increasing number of appearances thereafter in various European cities. What is worth noting here is that the character remained likable and pitiable at this point. Recall the reason for his invention: his rudeness to Jesus. It is remarkable for such a character to become well-liked in the popular imagination. This will prove to be a very important observation because the wandering Jew became a boorish bearer of bad luck in later periods. This indicates that the character's development reflected processes, the position of the Church vis-a-vis the Jews in general, and the social role that Jews came to occupy in Europe. The period that separates the good and kindly wandering Jew from his depiction in the 17th century reveals the legend's clear transformation. In the 15th and 16th centuries in Western Europe, it was believed that the wandering Jew was a frightening figure who, as a bad omen, only accompanied the appearance of storms. In such places he was spoken of in whispers. When a storm arose, people gathered together to pray that their town might be spared from a visit by the wanderer. This belief naturally reflected a dominant Christian position of the age. As is the case with any historical classification, we cannot draw definitive temporal boundaries. Heuristically, however, we can regard the 16th century as the line that separates two entirely different characters. One lived prior to this century and the other developed after its conclusion. The latter set out from Central Europe, where Jewish communities were increasing in size. The beginning of the 17th century brought with it a new depiction of the wandering Jew, as is evident in the widely translated popular song from this period in Brussels called The Complaints of the Wandering Jew. The character assumes the name of Isaac Lakudim for the first time, which suggests the work of a Jewish mind in writing the song, as Lakudim is a slight modification on the Hebrew word lakadem, which means old. This name soon spread to other literary works thereafter. The song reflects the changing nature of the wandering Jew from a man whose preoccupations revolved around pleading for forgiveness, to a man who complains about poverty and homelessness. I don't have a home to shelter me. And I don't have a treasure to present. Yet, a mysterious power grants me 5 pennies each day. These pennies became of utmost importance in the legends that followed. The character would be keen to collect them until they amounted to the price of a jewel that he would tie to his torso, in anticipation of more. Such legends reflected the economic position of European Jews, as represented by Shylock in one of Shakespeare's best-known plays. But just as Shylock had to wait for a writer like Sir Walter Scott to popularize him in Ivanhoe, Isaac Lakudim had to wait for Christoph Kreutzer in 1602 to popularize the wandering Jew as a non-Shylockian hero, called Ahasuerus. In that year, Kreutzer wrote a booklet in German with the following title: A Jew called Ahasuerus, who personally witnessed the crucifixion of the Lord Christ and participated in the demonstration. It was determined that Ahasuerus never returned to Jerusalem. This was why he couldn't see his children and wife again, and he had to remain alive since that time. Then he came to Hamburg for a few years. He was seen in Danzig around December 1599. This booklet did not contain much more information than its peculiar title provides. But it was republished 46 consecutive times in German, 19 in Swedish, 10 in French, 4 in Danish, 3 in Finnish, along with several others in English, Czech, Polish and other languages. The document is significant because it popularized the wandering Jew in Europe, strictly within the confines of religious doctrine and without promoting oppressive measures, and served as a key source for subsequent books that drew on the ideas and travels of wandering Ahasuerus. These ideas continued to develop through the Romantic era, during which Jewish characters in Europe were changing. An important development occurred here: the Jewish mind was starting to contribute to shaping the legend of Ahasuerus. But the extremist current intervened once more to advance the character into the arena of the hero, Daniel Deronda, and rendered him as a superior and infallible spokesman on behalf of the race. This turning point seems apparent in the circumstances that surrounded a certain letter that suddenly spread across the continent at the end of the 17th century, which came to be one of several common tales of the wandering Jew. There is no doubt, upon examination, that chauvinistic Jewish forces had either authored this letter or at least influenced it significantly. The letter in question was prefaced with a narrative of a Turkish spy in Paris, who is writing a report to Constantinople in 1644 on the wandering Jew's opinions, positions and true nature in full detail after meeting him in Paris. There is no Turkish evidence for any part of these claims, of course, as the nature of the letter will soon reveal. That it was authored on behalf of Jewish chauvinism will also be clear. A reliable history of the publication of this letter does not exist. The letter itself dates to 1644, but this does not necessarily mean that it was published then. The entire story was probably written by several authors well after 1644. It was also probably articulated in such terms, because it seemed like the most effective way of presenting the conditions of the Jews and their ambitions, and was most effective in persuading the audience of their superiority and innocence. In any case, this letter played an important role in taking the wandering Jew from the realm of folklore to that of the novel, the form that would become highly popular, as evidenced by the large number of volumes that were published between 1840 and 1860 especially, and which imbued the wandering Jew with its romanticism and prompted its rebirth as a symbol. The legacy of the letter of the purported Turkish spy, which came to be regarded as an artistic source, was further developed by Christian Daniel Schubart's poetry in the 18th century, where the wandering Jew boasts of his superiority thanks to the wisdom he had accumulated over his long travels. The legend strayed from its religious origins and popular context from this point. Once a direct reflection of the Jew's social and, later, political conditions, the legend soon became a vehicle for racism. In England, for example, the legend disappeared from the 13th century up to the mid-17th, which overlaps with the expulsion of the Jews in 1290 until their return in Cromwell's time. The legend began to grow once more from this point onward. But it did not occupy a prominent role in English thought until Jews themselves managed to achieve a higher status in British society. In his study on Jewish characters in English literature, Edgar Rosenberg does not record any text on the wandering Jew during most of the 18th century. But from 1796, i.e., around the beginning of the 19th century, until 1900, he records around 10 novels featuring the character, where it was intended as an interjection in religious affairs, at times, while being cast as a political figure in others. The fact is that English poetry, especially that of Shelley, 1792 to 1822, and Lord Byron, 1788 to 1824, preceded the English novel in dealing with the question of the wandering Jew. Shelley wrote his poem Queen Mab around the time of Harrington's publication, where the wandering Jew was made into a symbol of eternal protest against his unjust sentence. Thus, his demand for freedom here becomes more important than forgiveness. Many critics believe that Shelley was influenced by Schubart's 1739 to 1791 poem, which was discussed above, where the character was transformed from a religious symbol to one of intellectual superiority. This is the same tendency that influenced the great poet Goethe, 1749 to 1832. In the 19th century especially, the character of the wandering Jew began to change in Europe, from a sinner to an accuser, and from a repentant figure to a rebel. It was not a coincidence that this change occurred in Germany first, as Jews enjoyed a period of reprieve there at the time. The Romantic influence on poetry that dealt with the wandering Jew did not last long, as was the case with its influence on novels. In 1844, i.e., During the same period when Disraeli's The Wondrous Tale of Ulroy was published and later criticized by Eliot, in preparation for her publication of Daniel Deronda, Eugene Sue wrote the novel The Wandering Jew, where the traditional question of the wandering Jew was turned into a social question, completely severed from its religious origins. This was also the case when Jacques Fromental Halévy, 1799–1862, wrote his opera La Juive in France, which criticized racism against the Jews before the ink from The Wondrous Tale of Ulroy had dried. The work was written in 1834 and intended as a basis for his future opera The Wandering Jew, 1852, which did not garner much success. Up until around this point, as we have seen, the literary works that dealt with the wandering Jew were oriented toward resolving the Jewish question, and were implicitly demanding social equality through Jewish integration into their respective societies. We see this, for instance, when Eugene Sue, in The Wandering Jew, focused on man's inhumanity to man, as well as Halévy's opposition to the racist enslavement of Jews. Indeed, there was an inclination, on part of a large number of authors, to articulate the eternal journeying of the wandering Jew, along with other characters later on, in defense of his cause. The character thus continued to represent a social issue, above all, until the racist pressures on it exploded most evidently in David Pinsky's 1906 Yiddish play The Eternal Jew, which was translated into English as The Stranger by another Jewish writer called Isaac Goldberg. What is noteworthy here is the sudden shift in the Jewish mind toward the legend of the wandering Jew. The legend, according to the minds of Jews and non-Jews, was once compatible. In the Jewish mind it symbolized the prophet Elijah, who was known in folkloric Jewish culture as the Eternal Jew, and represented virtue and faith, as per prevailing religious mythology of Judaism. According to Jewish religious scholars, there are 36 wandering and immortal Jews, not just one, whose mission is to help the deserving, to console and protect the widow, the orphan, and the aged, and ailing, and, above all, to remind people that if they have implicit faith, all will be well with them and the world. This religious message gave way to a purely political one by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, thanks to the pressures of the chauvinistic Jewish current that placed its bets on a deliberate strategy of advancing a racist position. After 20 centuries of a purely religious existence, the wandering, or eternal, Jew now carried weapons and ideas of conquest in Pinsky's The Stranger. The Habema theater group thus adopted the play immediately and presented it to the Jews of Eastern Europe, and subsequently to Jews worldwide to serve even greater ambitions. The wandering Jew figure in The Stranger says, "Yes, I am a sinner. I have committed the greatest sin. For I was plowing my field when I should have been taking part in the struggle for the freedom of my people. Now God's terrible punishment is upon me. I shall have to wander all over the world, and long, long shall I seek the Messiah. Now I go to do what I must, what I must. I will search for the Messiah for a long, long time. I will now do what I have to do. I will do what I have to do." Commenting on this theater group, Raikin Ben-Ari, a founder of Habema, writes, "I still see Zemach, i.e., the actor who played the part of the farmer prophet, before me, lifting his bag and staff with a piercing sigh, climbing up to the top of the construction, where exclaimed in a mystic tone of voice, 'Ani holek luhaps et hamashaya.' I am going in search of the Messiah." These were not empty words for him. He was always looking for a Messiah himself, for the theater, for the people. He believed in the redemption of his people and hoped that the Habema would bring the problem of the Jew before the eyes of the world. This excerpt precisely summarizes the political instrumentalization of a religious matter. It was not a coincidence, as we will see, for politically chauvinistic Jews to have widely promoted this play along with Daniel Deronda, which also mixed religion and race under the banner of the national homeland. Just within half a century, These three elements established the most grotesque case of settler colonial conquest in modern history. The play facilitated the wandering Jew's newfangled political journey. In 1920, the theatres of London saw another play called The Wandering Jew by Ernest Temple Thurston. While being martyred before the courts of the Spanish Inquisition after his long journey, and martyrdom here signifies emancipation, the wandering Jew exclaims, "The spirit of your Christ is closer to my heart, as a Jew, than it is to the lips of those who claim to believe in him." This claim reflects new chauvinistic pretensions in which Zionism would perform a political funeral for the wandering Jew, in the form of a 1933 Yiddish film produced in Jaffa. Likewise in 1948, the wandering Jew was utilized in a new mission in The Industry of the Nazi Catastrophe, at the hands of Vittorio Gassman in the film The Sands of Time, where the character symbolizes the steadfastness of the Jewish spirit in the terrible Nazi camps. The Nobel Prize-winning Swedish writer Per Lagerkvist would then write a short story called The Death of Ahasuerus, in the early 1960s. The wandering Jew here arrives in Palestine and dies, after severely scolding God, "Why do you force me to think of you continually? To think of how you came along the street, dragging your cross?" He thus not only compares Jesus's suffering and sacrifice to his own, but regards his sentence of having to wander for so long as far worse, before presenting his death, i.e., the conclusion of his wandering, or the establishment of Israel, as humanity's true guide. As we will see shortly, this position runs in parallel with those that was found in novels. It is a position that Aaron David Gordon, 1856–1922, summarized like this: "We, Jews, have the distinction of being the guides not because we're better than the rest, but because of our excessive suffering."